isn't it more than a lifestyle movement? Because we're also rethinking the way we get food, the way we produce things, the what we consume, what we don't consume.
Yeah, well, of course, there are many organizations which work on that sort of those sort of questions, but most of them do not actually live it. Most of them they go to conferences and they write papers and so forth. The difference is that the eco-village people are actually doing it. And that's why I said that's why we supported them in God Trust from the beginning, because I said it's very important too to do research and to have theories and articles about how we can become more sustainable. But what differentiates the eco-village movement is that they're actually doing it on the ground. They're living it. That's why I say it's a lifestyle movement.
So, and I'm coming back to my question again, though, but for example, if you look at the US now and in many countries around the world, it's corporations that control resources and that even control governments. So,
Yeah.
how does one, so lifestyle changes by, I don't know what percentage of the world lives in eco villages, but I presume it's a very small percentage.
Very, very small,
Lifestyle
marginal.
changes by a small percentage of the world's population, how will that influence corporations who are still privatizing and monopolizing resources around the world? And that is what has to be disrupted, right? Because
Well,
otherwise our ecologies are just being destroyed continuously.
yeah, exactly. Well, one of the uh, scenarios that we talked about when we founded this movement was the fact that as I mentioned briefly before, our feeling is that the civilization is actually in the process of destroying itself. You know, it's crashing. It's been, in my opinion, I've written books about this. You know, the society has been collapsing for about 50 or 60 years. The civilization does not collapse overnight. It happens over many decades, but we're well into that collapse actually right now. And uh, if and when things get really bad, you know, whether there's perhaps a major war or it could be due to extreme climate conditions and whatever, people eventually may find that there's no food left on the shelves and there's no power left and there's no more internet. And where do they go from there? And our thinking was that the eco villages will survive. They could be a place to collect and to rebuild. Now, an interesting example of this was the Russia-Ukraine war. When that broke out about 3 years ago, a number of the residents of the cities in Ukraine were being bombed and were forced to leave into the countryside. And many of them discovered the existence of these eco-villages. There was a network in Ukraine, just like in most other countries. And many of them went there and discovered there's a different way of living. And they were the eco-village movement, particularly in Europe, within just a few days of the crisis of the war starting, had developed pathways for people to get out and pathways for materials and blankets and food to get in. Much more before any of the large aid organizations could get onto it. They took the aid organizations 3 months to get organized. The eco-villages were there within a couple of days. And so this is one of the things that we envisaged at the beginning, that this would be perhaps a natural place to go when things start falling apart. And that's exactly what happened in Ukraine. And the whole of Europe backed up on them. And they managed to get people placed in different cities, different towns in Europe, some in eco-villages and some in other places. So it's not a very nice way to think of how it might happen, but it's not unthinkable that it will take a major crisis before people realize how important this way of living can be. And hopefully then, if they do get to have that experience, that when they do start to rebuild, they will keep the same values and realize that we mustn't repeat the same mistakes again.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, and I'm trying not to have a dystopian vision in my mind as you describe this, but so do you envision the Eco-Village network to kind of be a fallback or an alternative to when the current system collapses, and then there will be these eco-villages around the world where people can demonstrate to the other people, hey, this is how you can live but so it's not so much transforming what exists into something else, but it's kind of this is a parallel system that exists and you can come to
Yeah.
it when your current system doesn't work. Is that?
I think it's a plausible scenario. It's also possible that it might happen much more gradually and just gradually grow and become larger and become perhaps more likely that we're going to go through some major crises before we really see the value of this system.
You had mentioned that you had thought it would go faster. Is there a way to accelerate this process, or are you worried about it, or do you think it should just go at the pace that it's going?
Yeah, I'm not worried. No, I think it goes at the pace that it's going, and we can't force it. So yeah, it will evolve as it evolves, you know, and it is continually growing, but still fairly marginal. But there are now thousands of these places around the world in just about every country. So you don't have to go very far if you want to join such a place or look into it. There's one nearby, no matter where you live, you know.
And where do local and indigenous knowledge systems how do they come into play in eco-villages? How are they implemented? How do they come into play?
Um, we don't have any direct relationship with the indigenous movements, but we I would say that we have a very similar value systems, and I think that the indigenous peoples, the ones that have discovered the eco-age movement, agree with that they probably come the closest to the original values of the indigenous peoples, although there's still major differences in it. Um, the eco-age people perhaps have a higher degree of acceptance of technology. You know, we have our iPhones and the internet and so forth, but we have the same values, and that's where I think the common values arise.
And where does the funding come from for eco-villages now? I think the Gaia Trust closed, right, last year. So
Yeah.
how do
Well,
people fund their eco-villages?
um, well, the Gaia Genesis continues to try to raise funds from various foundations and so forth, and they generate some income themselves. For example, Gen Europe holds a big conference every summer, which attracts 700 or 800 people. And this year, as I mentioned, it's the 30-year anniversary, which this year is going to be held in Hungary. That is a major source of income for Gen Europe. And there are also various foundations and some governments which have supported them. But it's like many other NGOs, you know, it's a question of doing fundraising and finding the people who would like to support your cause. I'm sure you probably have the same problem in your NGO. And of course, Gaia Education is a bit different because it holds various courses, both online and face-to-face, which people have to pay to participate in. And so they have a more certain income flow than Jen has.
I
But
see.
Jen is
So
Jen has a lot of volunteers also that help it keep it going.
So if a project or a community wants to become an eco village that's part of Gen, do they get, I understand they get expertise help and other members of the community show them how to do things or help
Yeah.
them conceptually. Do they also get funding from Gen
No,
to
no.
us?
And Gaia Trust has never funded individual projects. We couldn't afford that. You know, we would take millions and millions of dollars every year. So that's why we had to focus on building networks because that we could do on a relatively on a shoestring, you know, relatively speaking.
So in the network, how does it work in terms of people sharing their knowledge? Do they share it freely or is there a fee or how does that work?
Oh, yes, they share it freely. Yes, and as I say, on the Gen website, we have a knowledge base that is built up from the contributions of many different people around the globe, and that's all available for free for anyone who's interested.
Oh, well, so where do you see this going? What are your aspirations for Gen in the future and other projects that you're involved in?
Well, I hope it will continue to survive, and I hope it will get more support. I think governments ought to be supporting this kind of a movement, but they haven't. A lot of them haven't discovered it yet, although a few have. So I think my hope is that they will survive and continue to grow slowly, and be there, you know, as an example, and more people will be influenced by it. I mean, I'm continually hearing examples of people who knew nothing about the eco-village movement, and once they maybe to discover an eco-village in their region, it's often what is described as being a life-changing experience. Yeah, well, that is in fact something we have heard very often, and that's encouraging. I think that so many people feel that this is something which is very inspiring and unusual. And as the word gets around, I think that there's a possibility that this will become mainstream at some point in some form. Maybe in not quite exactly the same form as today, but something similar.
Well, thank you very much for your time today. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Nice to be here.